We were doing the one-to-ones. So,
Thank you so much for joining us.
when you're doing the one-to-ones, you were kind of like the little dots on that one picture. We separated you up and got you all separated into just two people at a time. What we've now done is given you an opportunity to work at a table, so we've created little clouds. But the real model is, how do the clouds get together to communicate with each other? And we call that a plenary session. So what we'd like to do at this point is to hear from you all what kind of reactions, discussion, what came to the top, what were the things at your table? Who would like to start us out on that?
I think our little cloud just rained and rained tears until.
But you have to speak
I think
loud.
our little cloud just rained and rained tears until it dissipated.
What were the tears about?
Yeah. Stand up, Matt. Thank you.
We recognize the system we're in, but also like our complicity in the system, and at the same time the difficulty of stepping outside that system. Yeah, so we just dealt with that. Thanks.
Anyone else? What about at this table?
I don't think that's funny, we didn't talk at all about feelings, did we?
No.
So that wasn't the point, but we had a great conversation. Did we talk about?
Let's hope we're out.
Well, talked about something, nothing came to the top.
Media and iPhones and household
Yeah,
individuals.
we also talked about complicity, and the necessity of complicity to survive, not being able to even imagine an alternative because we've been born and enculturated into this.
Part of it is how everything that we buy, the technology and everything, becomes an influence into our culture. And so everything that we bring into our lives, popular culture, cell phones, iPads, iPods, tablets, becomes part of what defines us.
So if everything we bring in somehow defines us, what kind of things could we bring in that would help the definition get to where we think it ought to be?
No, here. That's not empty.
What would that look like?
Where you go, Marie?
Less bringing in.
Yeah.
Focusing on your neighbors.
Oh yeah, we talked about
Getting
that.
to know the person next door, 2 doors down, 3 doors down, making sure they don't block and use each other. And focusing there rather than social networks.
So I have to say that I live in a little homeowners association, and there are only 4 units and eight families. And we're having trouble getting along. It's like so depressing.
We should laugh.
I live right in the middle kind of unit, and the families at the 2 opposite ends, they had actually I had to go stand between them in a meeting to keep them from hitting each other. It's like, it's like, what hope is there for the world when I can't even live in a little tiny neighborhood? But you're on target in terms of something we're going to talk about more later in terms of relationships and how to build those relationships, because that's the key. We can't do this. We can't remain little dots. We've got to be in a relationship. So good. Yes.
Well, along that line, the church meeting that I attend, we have managed somehow to use social media in a very effective way. We've got a Facebook page that only only people who attend that meeting have access to. And that has been so helpful because people feel okay about sharing things that maybe they wouldn't. I mean, there'll be all sorts of people from you know, that I wouldn't see on Sunday or wouldn't talk to, that I hear what's going on in their lives during the week because they share on Facebook.
So instead of allowing the media to co-opt you all, you're co-opting the media.
Yeah, it has been so good.
That's great. What about this other side over here? Yes.
We raised that same issue, actually Rhonda did. She said without the social media, the turnout for last week's march would not have been anywhere near what it was.
That's true.
And yet, then we talk about, but we're so addicted to the gadgets and have to have the newest one every year. It's the iPhone 6, it'll be 7 by the time I'm at my next birthday will be up to 13 already. and the resources that we pull out of the ground to create those gadgets is something we don't even think about. And yet the media itself is not a problem, it's how we use it or abuse it. I love Marty's line. Marty said that corporations are amoral, and I think they are. But are they ethical? So that we had a lot of conversation.
Amoral versus immoral.
Right.
Or versus moral.
Or versus
Or
moral.
yeah, they're not moral, they're not immoral, they're amoral, but are they ethical? So we had a lot of conversation around that
So
and
what,
how it impacts the market and how it impacts people and the environment.
so what is the media, what does it cost you to do this with Facebook and others?
Well, Facebook itself is free, but you have to have the platform on which to participate. So you have to have a computer or an iPhone or something.
But who's paying for that Facebook piece?
Nobody.
Oh, advertising, the market.
Advertising.
The market.
So it's
The
part of the
market.
addicting process.
Right, right.
Part of the addicting process. It's over there.
Well, this is interesting, vis-a-vis the comment about social media sort of helping the turnout. Because what I heard from Deborah, out of her own experience in civil rights movement in Vietnam, she's saying that the kind of energy she experienced then is not present now. Right? Partly because of this. Because everyone's energy is so dissipated, right, with all this stuff. So,
And isolated.
so it could be a tool, and yet, if you step back, what are the greater impacts on social movements? With regard, so at least from your experience.
I know there's some agendas that I have in relation to sustainability at our church, and I've recognized that I probably can't provide a lot of leadership in that unless I'm in relationship with people. And so I've actually had to set out to build some relationships that I didn't have in order to be able to even get to the point of discussing or talking about those things in the area of sustainability that might not come to their attention if I didn't. But that relationship building, which session are we going to deal in? Relationships. In six, yeah. So in one of our later sessions, we'll talk a lot about the importance of this relationship and how we think is a good way to build it and so forth. So any other comments here? Yes.
I just want to add a few more feelings from our table.
Good.
Some feelings were powerlessness and anger at being essentially irrelevant in this picture. Like, everybody I know, everybody I care about, everything I care about is completely irrelevant, except insofar as we feed the market. And that makes me angry.
You're here, sister.
What about over here?
We talked also about the isolation and the,
Well, isolation was a topic that came up here, and how we are those little dots in our institutions, and we're little dots out in the big circle. we're insignificant dust. And in a certain sense, it's intentional, it's not unintentional. How many cars do we see driving down the road that have only one driver in it? They're isolated from other drivers, they're not getting together with others. How many homes have multiple TVs in them, and they're all on at the same time watching a different program with one person in front of each one being marketed to? Common, maybe not in your households, but not uncommon at all. And isolation is almost something that keeps us consuming, right? If the only messages we get are from the advertisers in terms of what we need and how they define us, that keeps us addicted.
That was it. The consumption and the addiction were the parts that I was. But we also talked a little bit about possible things to do, like moving money.
Right, her church got together and decided that they would move their money out of traditional banks and move it into a credit union because it made more sense to them. Cool thing to do.
And this community and this church provide a lot of leadership to move money out of banks. They wrote me in the process, I don't even go here. And we moved well over $500,000 out of various banks and into a credit union in this area that was willing to work with us on projects. So it is possible to have an impact. You didn't talk too much about feelings, so now that you've heard this discussion, any feelings come to the top for you?
We had some before.
First group talked about feelings.
I aired all mine. I feel much better. She's actually healed. It'll probably keep coming. I'm sure it'll keep coming.
Well, we don't actually want you to feel good at this point.
We're in the
It does
process.
feel awful, and I consider myself to be a person who's awake, but one of the things that we talked about is that we don't get to talk about this. We don't get to talk about it in people that are really close to us or even far from us. You don't get to have these conversations about how painful it is to be that insignificant and to be crying out. I mean, I know people around me all the time who are wanting to be with people, wanting to share meals, wanting to trade food, wanting to learn how to do a trade, and yet it's almost like there's some invisible force between everybody that discourages them from getting off this poison. And it makes me angry, sad. It's like being hangry, you know. It's
Angry.
you know, and it makes me want to have a voice. It makes me want to find the answer. It makes me want to get to know people.
Yay.
But we do know that anger can be very productive. Action actually gets generated out of anger. So if you are feeling a little bit angry at this point, consider it as something that can be productive in producing results as we move along in our discussions.
I think we're living in chronic sorrow. Sorrow, and part sorrow is anger.
Yes.
But I like your thought about it always seems like there's a force field keeping us. The intrusion upon another person, that powerful sense of privacy versus the needs that we all have as human beings. They're just very powerful cultural forces that lead us to the level of isolation that we think really other people want. Self-sufficiency, which is a delusion we were talking about earlier, because all of our gadgets allow us to think that we don't need anybody.
Right.
For the means of life in the past,
Right.
people needed each other.
Judith?
Yeah, among other things that we talked about maybe that three-legged stool model isn't necessarily the model we want to reclaim for ourselves, the idea of recovering that model, but there really maybe is a different future that we can't even envision, but it's not necessarily that we want to get back to that three-legged model. And in that conversation, one of the things we talked about was that maybe finger pointing at the market isn't productive or helpful or the thing we need to be doing, but rather creating relationships with the people in the market and influencing in that way, changing it from through creating those relationships with people who think differently, who think about a different universe, and who have learned that what we've come from isn't working, but by being in relationship with those businesses and people within the market, we can change the market that way.
That is one of the problems we face, is that if we really don't necessarily want to see ourselves as going back to that, and we're going to move forward to something, we've got to be very creative in coming up with what that something is.
Yeah, and just be careful about the finger pointing, because
Yes.
that's not helpful.
Everybody works for them, so.
Right, exactly.
So we are ostracizing ourselves. How do we make a living if we're gonna say that that's an evil situation where we're all part of it? It's not necessarily, doesn't have to be that way in nature.
One more comment, then we've got
There's something that dawned on me when I heard the constant state of sorrow, or just that notion of isolation, is we kind of feel we're such little communities, kind of like this one, and we're all so disconnected, and we feel like there's no one else out there, but at the same time, there's really knowledgeable people that write about these things. There's books being published, so that just, which brings me, which is going to be announced later on by the reading by Naomi Klein at Powell's, and I mean, those are people that sell millions of books writing about these very things that we're talking about. So if they're selling so well, there's a lot of people that are interested in this, and I think we tend to forget, we're so caught up in that big no very often that we tend to forget that there's so many people that have a similar interest, that are really curious to learn more about this, and the big question would be, how can we have all these people join arms, so to speak, and get into that action part of it. But there's a lot of people out there. It's not like we're so isolated and alone that we're just weird people because we think this way. It's becoming more and more common, and I think we need to recognize that strand of the piece as well.
And people download them onto their Kindle and read them at home by themselves.
Well, at least they're reading about it.
At least they're reading about it. Yeah.
I mean, the worst thing is that those books are written and no one reads them.
Yeah.
But there is curiosity and hunger there. And
But we need to get into that community.
yes.
I see a book group forming, or a lot of